Hi guys, last video, yay! All right, so we're looking at contemporary issues, starting off with surrogacy and birth technology on this video. We'll do birth technology first because surrogacy almost always involves the use of birth technology, so they're kind of intertwined. Birth technology refers to artificial conception instead of sexual intercourse. A woman becomes pregnant through the processes like IVF. In New South Wales, the main law that covers these processes is the Artificial Reproductive Technology Act. Issues in birth technology. I forgot to open up the booklet and remind you of page numbers. Let me grab that. Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. We are on page 77 of your work booklet. All right, issues. Who's the daddy or mummy? If a woman is inserted with the sperm of a donor, a man other than her partner, then when the child is born, the partner of the woman, not the sperm donor, is the legal father of the child. This is called the Presumption of Paternity and was introduced as part of the Status of Children Act in 1996 to make sure that sperm donors don't have to pay child support. The Status of Children Act assumed that the partner would be a man, but the Miscellaneous Acts Amendment Samesex Relationship Act of 2008 allowed for the female partner of a woman who gives birth through IVF the same rights as a parent as if she were a man, which is a good thing. There's a little bug on my computer screen. So lesbian couples can have IVF rights. There can be two mums on a birth certificate. A gay male couple would have trouble with the whole IVF thing, but they can be named on a birth certificate if there was a surrogacy arrangement. Gay Dad's birth certificate ruling welcomed, said ABC News back in 2013. So, yeah, IVF, birth technologies, that's it, done. Surrogacy. This is when one woman carries and delivers a child for another woman. So some of you might remember Indy did her presentation on surrogacy back when we were looking at technology and the law in prelim. So some of this might sound familiar. Okay, serious issues are raised when it comes to surrogacy. The main problem is that the surrogate mother, the woman carrying the child, often ends up developing a bond with the child. So sometimes she won't want to give the baby over to the parents when it's born. Whoop, this may happen with any type of surrogacy. Sorry, I clicked too quickly. There are different types of surrogacy. We'll get into them. Okay, so the other problem is with commercial surrogacy. So this is one type of surrogacy. This is when the surrogate mother gets paid. Why is that a problem? Well, if you could get paid for having a child, kids would become property or a service that you could sell. So that brings us this idea of, babies are us, which doesn't sound ethically correct. Also, what is stopping the surrogate mother from holding the baby for ransom, agreeing on a price? Then when the baby comes, she says, I want more, forcing the wannabe parents to pay or they won't get their child. In New South Wales, we have the Surrogacy Act of 2010. Commercial surrogacy, when you get paid for it, under the Surrogacy Act of New South Wales, is illegal. Altruistic surrogacy is when you don't get paid for it. This is legal. So if you do something altruistically, you are doing it without the expectation of some kind of reward or payoff. Legal responses to surrogacy. Until 2011, New South Wales did not have clear enough surrogacy laws. The ART Act of 2007, New South Wales, was unclear and ineffective when it came to surrogacy. This led to cases with some very bizarre outcomes. In the case of Michael in 2009, where neither of the two people found to be the parents were at all biologically related to the child, and neither of the biological parents were found to be the child. How does that make sense? Okay, so there's a surrogate mother. Perhaps it was her egg that was used and donor sperm that was used. When the child was born, the parents who organised the surrogacy were found to be the parents. Yeah, that's how it works. Okay, so in response to this problem, well, and it is a little bit of a problem, it is hard for people to wrap their head around. So the New South Wales government held an inquiry, we'll just call it the Surrogacy Inquiry of 2009. They received submissions from everyone from the Australian Christian lobby to the gay and lesbian rights lobby. The outcome of the surrogacy inquiry was that the New South Wales government passed the Surrogacy Act of 2010. And just before I move on, I'm filming this on Thursday, hence my yellow t-shirt with a big dog face on it. Are you okay, Dave? Hope you are all okay. Okay, the Surrogacy Act had two goals. First goal was to clarify the law in New South Wales on altruistic, no money, surrogacy. The law now allows for new parentage orders that can be granted by the Supreme Court to transfer parentage in surrogacy situations. The main concern of the court is still the best interests of the child rather than the rights of the adults involved. But these cannot be granted if it is a case of commercial surrogacy, which leaves kids in those situations vulnerable. There was a case referenced in Australian commercial surrogacy laws leaves 6-month-old twin in legal limbo, ABC News 2017. The family court wouldn't name the biological parents as the parents, only giving them parental responsibility because they admitted to entering into a commercial surrogacy in the US and came back to Australia. The second goal of the Surrogacy Act was to ban overseas commercial surrogacy by New South Wales residents. The New South Wales Attorney General believed that this is a logical step because commercial surrogacy is already, or was both illegal in New South Wales. The reason given for the ban was to stop wealthier couples in New South Wales from exploiting poor women overseas in poor countries like India and the United States. The penalties have been seen by some as too harsh, up to 2 years jail and a $110,000 fine, and not providing enough legal protection for the children involved in such arrangements. Overseas commercial surrogacy became a really big issue in Australia in mid-2014 because of the awful baby Gummy case. And couple? Ugh. Syntax, woman. Oh, it says a couple in your workbook. It's okay. A couple from WA used a surrogate mother in Thailand, which would have been illegal in New South Wales. She had twins. One was born with Down syndrome. This was baby Gummy, and baby Gummy was left in Thailand. But the couple from Western Australia did bring the other child home. The very idea of this was a shock, not only using a woman in a poor country to have your baby, but then leaving the baby there because she's not healthy, an option people don't have when they have children naturally. The media's response was very strong, drawing attention to the issue, which was positive because it made people really think about the legal options for preventing another scenario like this. Suggestions included banning overseas surrogacy in every state, legalising commercial surrogacy in Australia so people don't have to go overseas, or leave it as it is and hope the issue just goes away. It wouldn't have been in the news if they'd done the right thing after all. So in terms of media articles, they ranged from the Gammy's case. Commercial surrogacy should be legalised, lawyers say. Gammy's father wanted surrogate mum to abort. Give money back, said the Australian. I have included in your supplementary clips a 60 Minutes report on baby Gummy. Links in the show notes, links in the supplementary clips. But that's not the end of baby Gummy. You'll never guess what happened in the end. When she found out that the Australian man who brought her non-disabled child back to Australia happened to be a sex offender. Yeah, you heard that. The woman who gave birth to the twins launched a family court battle to bring that twin back. The other twin was Pippa. The judge decided that too much time had passed, so Gammy's non-disabled twin Pippa was settled in her life in Australia. That Gummy was apparently not abandoned. The surrogate mum just decided to send away her healthy baby, keeping her disabled child, yes. And the Australian sex offender was only a very low risk of abusing the girl now in his care. And it was all safe because an order was made for Pippa to never be left alone with him. The judge did point out that cases like this are bound to happen if paying surrogates, especially overseas, keeps happening. When we watched for human rights the boy with the henna tattoo, we have seen that, yes, there can be a lot of issues with surrogacy, birth and sex offenders, and we don't need to talk about that anymore. Thailand, Nepal and Cambodia banned commercial surrogacy because couples, including from Australia, were going to these countries to pay poor women to have babies for them. It's not so simple though. When they impose a ban on a certain date, it means that any woman who was already pregnant with an Australian couple's baby could be imprisoned for being paid the money she obviously needed. Authorities in countries that are now banning surrogacy are finding that Australian couples are just moving on to another country to pay a surrogate though. They've also found that some Australians have been running agencies that arrange these agreements to happen. Cambodia surrogacy, Australian nurse Tammy Davis-Charles sent back to jail. Sydney Morning Herald, 2016. This has again raised the issue of allowing commercial surrogacy to happen in a regulated way in Australia, rather than allowing a situation to happen where parents are either going overseas to poor countries. Arrests and uncertainty overseas shows why Australia must legalise compensated surrogacy. Compensated. It's a much more delicate word than commercial. Okay, sorry. They're either going overseas to poor countries or illegally paying for or asking for money in Australia. Surrogacy booming in Australia despite legal issues. ABC 2017. Since these bans, and even the thought that a ban might happen while your surrogate is still pregnant overseas has been happening. There's been a huge increase in the number of surrogacy agreements happening in Australia. The issue of getting paid or wanting to pay surrogate parents comes up in just about every one of these, but nobody will admit to doing it because it's illegal. However, there is a serious problem when it comes to the jurisdiction of surrogacy. This has led to very different laws in different states. For example, someone from Queensland would have to move to Tasmania so they could adopt a baby from India. I do remember this being part of Indy's presentation when she did it. So, like I said, some of it hopefully sounds a little bit familiar to you. Okay, so let's look at the table that's in your booklets. Let's look at New South Wales. So when it comes to surrogacy laws, New South Wales, altruistic plus costs. So you're not getting paid to produce the baby, but all your medical costs are covered as part of an altruistic agreement. Yes, that can happen. International commercial allowed in New South Wales? Nope. Background checks need to be done in New South Wales? Nope. Counselling and legal advice required? Yes, that's a good one. Parentage order is through court application? Yes. And gay couples also have access to the same rules in New South Wales as non-gay parents wishing to enter into surrogate agreements. Let's go to Tasmania. Yes, you can have altruistic surrogacy arrangement. Yes, you can have international commercial surrogacy, and it's cool, bring your baby back there. No background checks have to be made. Yes, counselling has to be done. Yes, you go to magistrate courts, and yes, gay people can also have access to this. Western Australia, yes, No. Yes, committee approved. Family court? No, no, no. South Australia and Western Australia and the ACT, gay couples do not have access to the same laws around surrogacy as non-gay couples. This is discriminatory, and obviously this is just one of the issues in surrogacy laws. Non-legal responses. There's been heavy lobbying on both sides of the debate over birth technology and surrogacy. When the Queensland government decriminalised altruistic surrogacy back in 2010, the Australian Christian lobby was furious. The law would allow equal rights to same-sex couples and single people, because you need a mummy and a daddy to make a family. They promised to spend money campaigning against members of parliament who voted for the bill. And remember, a politician's job is to be elected, and so that is a very viable threat. Gay and lesbian rights lobby. They obviously fought for equal rights for all people, arguing that the key concern should be that the children are taken care of in a loving family of any structure, rather than a heterosexual married Christian family, whether it's supportive and loving or not. Just because the Bible preaches love doesn't mean that every religious sanctified union is one that has love in it. Non-legal responses. The media. The media has played a role in increasing awareness of an issue that affects a minority of the population. The debate received the most balanced coverage despite the titles of the program on the ABC's Four Corners, Made in Thailand, and Foreign Correspondent, The Babymakers 2014. They are a little bit older. There have been many things looking at surrogacy on television over the years. I actually have put together a massive list because there was so many. Look, 60 Minutes one, it's not bad, but it is a commercial station, so it is a little bit more maybe sensationalized. So Foreign Correspondent, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different ones there. You may choose to look at one, none, or any. 2 from Four Corners, 1 from Insight, which is an SBS program, and The Feed, which is also associated with the ABC. So if you do find this area of great interest, then it's well worth having a look at maybe 1 or 2 of these different docos that are out there. Some are longer than others. I mean, click on them and pick the short ones if you like. Oh, and they are in a separate supplementary clips link because there's so many and they're just on one issue. So I'll label that something like surrogacy supplementary clips, but everything will be attached as normal. No dramas. You should focus on, let's see. Well, that's right. We're evaluating the effectiveness of legal and non-legal responses to all of the contemporary issues we're looking at. Legal responses. The lack of clear surrogacy laws until 2010, including the failure of the previous Act, the ART Act of 2007. The lack of protection given to children of commercial surrogacy arrangements under the Surrogacy Act of 2010, because it is illegal already, and the children of such arrangements aren't really covered by our laws. 3, the harshness of penalties for commercial surrogacy under the Surrogacy Act of 2010. It may work as a deterrent, but it will be ineffective if actually enforced. It's not like you can say, well, you've got to take the baby back. And seriously, anyone who's desperate for a child will pursue whatever avenue they feel they need to. The surrogacy trap, why our laws need new life, ABC 2012. Note that nobody has been charged in Australia yet for breaking the law when it comes to commercial surrogacy. But more importantly, we do have a law that was created. Oh, hang on, let me click one more time. We do now have a law that has created arrangements to protect those involved in altruistic surrogacy arrangements through the new parentage orders. So we've got a lot of red when we're looking at legal responses to surrogacy and birth technologies, but we do have some little spots of green for the future. Hope. Non-legal responses. Okay, so you should focus on the fact that there are laws protecting parents and children in surrogacy situations at all is a positive step, given that these laws really only affect a tiny minority of people. Non-government organisations fighting for equality have had an effect on the law. There is continued concern about the power of religious lobby groups, particularly when it comes to influencing of politicians. That is the end of surrogacy and birth technology. Moving over the page now to page 84. Oh, no, not quite yet. I have linked a couple of articles. Well, they're in the supplementary clip links looking at surrogacy. So this was a very interesting one where a Brisbane sperm donor, Alan Fan, investigated after fathering 23 children. Should there be a limit on how many deposits one can leave at the sperm bank? Should there be 23 or 2,033 little Allens running around WA? Except it says Brisbane. Running around Queensland. Another case that I've linked for you for an article to read digitally is the fight for access to a little girl that went all the way to the High Court. So let me see if I can read this. The girl's biological father went to the High Court to stop her moving away from Australia. So 99% certain, it's been a while since I've read it. Biological father, sperm donor, and the parent who then raised the child wanted to move, and he wanted to be able to maintain a relationship with his daughter, and that case went all the way to High Court. Definitely worth having a little bit of a read there. Oh, I thought this was going to be care and protection, but no. Last one. New South Wales integrated birth certificates to allow children to include birth certificates to allow children to include both birth and adoptive parents. Integrated birth to allow children to include. Is that saying that the kids get to make the decision? Oh my God, I forget. But again, another article you can read looking at different ways that people have families and that you can use to reference. Here we are. Oh, we're not in a very nice place. We are looking now at the care and protection of children. And there are clear reasons why we need to consider and look at the care and protection of children. The picture that you are seeing here is a place where children lived. And the word lived possibly isn't the right word. House of Filth, Parents Avoid Jail, ABC News 2012. There were clothes and rubbish on the floors, and the children slept on stained mattresses without other bedding. The father told police he was an alcoholic who drank up to 4 bottles of scotch per day and spent his time looking for his next drink. He said he spent up to 22 hours a day playing computer games. Okay, I told you guys the story of the people that were living next door to me, that the room looked just as bad, if not worse than that the kids were in. And as the neighbour, I knew that they weren't very great people, but no idea. Another pretty story? Sorry, not. An Illawarra mum of child who ingested ice avoids jail on child neglect charge. An Illawarra mother who admitted to child neglect after her 2-year-old toddler ate the drug ice inside a Coonawarra home last year has avoided time behind bars. The woman, who cannot be named for legal reasons, was handed a 12-month suspended prison sentence. Luckily, in this case, the child was no longer in her care. She avoided jail, but she did lose her child. Okay, we're going to look at some statistics from the Australian Institute of Family Studies. Total number of notifications about children at risk of harm in Australia. I know these are 2016 numbers, but the reports aren't generated every minute or every year, so these numbers are fine. 355,000 kids. But remember that not everything gets reported, and some kids are reported more than one time. So 355,000 is not the total number of children that are actually at risk of harm. That is the number that have been reported, plus there would be some repeats on some kids. Number of these that were actually investigated. Have a guess? Oh, it's in your booklet, you don't have to. 165,000. Okay, I'm not the best mathematician, but that's less than 50%. Remember that this is affected by resources available to child protection authorities. Sometimes an investigation doesn't happen because of competing priorities, meaning that they have to choose between investigating one case instead of another. And thank God I'm not the person who has to make that decision. It must be incredibly difficult to work for one of these organisations that are supposed to look after the welfare of children if you have 355,000. Let's just even just say we had 355 cases that they said, there's a problem here. I don't have 355 people working for me. I have 5. And we have to work out how we're going to get to as many as possible, but we're obviously going to have to prioritise some cases over others. So it is a really difficult thing to do. Okay, so of the reported cases that were investigated, the number of these that were substantiated, that is, there was reasonable cause to believe it happened, was 60,000. Remember, this is affected by the fact that sometimes it's just covered up very well. So you could, report it. There could be things going on, but they get wind of a visit, and so they clean up the house. They teach the kids how to answer questions. Just because only 60,000 were substantiated doesn't mean that only 60,000 cases of 60,000 kids was the minimum number of kids that were at risk. Children out of home care in 2016 who were put into out of home care because they were in danger, 46,000. And whether you know it or not, there are quite a number of kids at our school, and we live in a small regional area. We don't have a huge population, but we do have quite a large number of kids who live in out of home care. So it is all around us, which is why learning about all this stuff is good. Still breaks my heart that I didn't realise what was happening in the house next door to me. Here I am, somebody who knows and understands all this stuff, and still, I guess I don't hate people enough, and maybe I should, and to absolutely, expect and think the worst. In New South Wales, the Department of Communities and Justice, this is the DOCJ. Previously, they've been known as FACS and DOCS, so Family and Community Services and Department of Children's Services. They both get referred to in your notes and back and forth because they were known by these other titles for such a long time, but do try to use DOCJ if you are talking about a contemporary issue in family law. Okay, so in New South Wales, the DOCJ is the main part of the government that protects the rights of children to protection from abuse or neglect within the family. The DOCJ is authorised to do a number of things. They can provide assistance to families so as to prevent abuse or neglect, and they are authorised to intervene or get involved where a child is in need of care and protection. This intervention can involve the extreme actions of: number 1, removing the children from their families, and 2, taking police action against the perpetrators of abuse. The police also have a role in ensuring the protection of children and young people from abuse and neglect by investigating allegations of child abuse or neglect that involve criminal conduct, in bringing criminal proceedings against perpetrators of abuse or severe neglect, and in applying for apprehended domestic violence orders for the protection of children and young people. Okay, you should know that the child protection system in New South Wales consists of much more than the DOCJ. It also includes New South Wales Health, the Department of Education and Training, that's me, Juvenile Justice, Disability and Home Care, Housing New South Wales, and the New South Wales Police offer programs, funding and services. Legal responses. 1990s. A legalistic way of dealing with care and protection of children. Oh, back in the day. Child protection work was focused on developing a legal response to allegations of child abuse and neglect and determining whether abuse or neglect was serious enough to warrant protective intervention. This approach meant that for child protection workers, investigative and administrative work took up a significant amount of time. Government funding for child protection and non-government family support services was also significantly cut. An example was the Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act of 1998, which brought in penalties for not reporting children at risk of harm. This led to situations where multiple mandatory reporters, including teachers, would report the same child to the department. It wasn't the DOCJ then, but the DOCJ now. In the 21st century, so where we live, they looked at finding some balance in dealing with less serious cases. By the late 90s, child protection services in all Australian states and territories were finding it really difficult to cope with high numbers of reports of suspected child abuse and neglect. The legal approach was being criticised for subjecting low-risk families to unnecessary investigations, while at the same time letting some high-risk families fall through the cracks. New models of child protection and family support were adopted in most states. Okay, this is a case that's actually pretty close to home, like as in down the road and around the corner for some of you. The DOCJ and other parts of the government get their power to assist and or intervene in families for the protection of children and young people from the Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act. In the mid-2000s, there was a lot of negative publicity, mainly aimed at facts, following a number of child deaths that attracted media attention. One of these was the case of Ebony, who died of neglect in Hawk's Nest. I have linked a very small news clip for you to have a look at that. If you were not aware, it was horrific, and like I said, I didn't realise it was happening next door to me here where I live, and I'm looking out the window at the house right now, and the child actually died from horrific neglect and abuse at a nice little normal suburban house right there in Hawk's Nest. Okay, so what happened with Ebony resulted, well, it wasn't just Ebony, there were quite a few kids, but the Ebony one was truly distressing. Resulted in a massive inquiry conducted by former Supreme Court Justice James Wood, he's a bit of a champion, to look into why the system was failing so many children. Justice Wood wrote a 1,100-page report that contains 111 recommendations, known as the Wood Inquiry Report. It was released in November of 2008. In 2009, the Children and Young Persons Wood Inquiry Recommendations Act was tabled in Parliament. It included many of the inquiry's recommendations and was passed. This legislation paved the way for implementing 106 of the Wood Inquiry Report recommendations across a 5-year period. As I said, Justice Wood champion. Keep Them Safe is the New South Wales Government response to the Wood Inquiry. It is a shared approach to child wellbeing. It is a 5-year plan to fundamentally change the way that children and families are supported and protected. Its aim to improve the safety, welfare and wellbeing of all children and young people in New South Wales. It has 2 main parts. The mandatory reporting system has been drastically changed, and a lot of the services provided by government are being transferred to non-government sector. The government will only deal with the most serious of cases. Okay, so you have a diagram in your booklet. It's a bit small for me to read on the screen from here, so I'm just going to look down. Okay, so who are the reporters of child neglect and abuse? Community members, non-government mandatory reporters, government health workers, they're mandatory, police, mandatory, juvenile justice workers, mandatory, government school principals, mandatory, government disability workers, mandatory, government housing workers, mandatory. Essentially, most people in health, the government and government jobs are mandatory reporters. If you suspect something, you have to report it under the law. Okay, so we as teachers are mandatory reporters. Okay, so if there is suspected risk of significant harm, the reports are supposed to go to Community Services Helpline, or in our case, we go to the Child Wellbeing Units. It then gets referred on. We actually have a tool available to us called the Mandatory Reporting Guidelines, where we can basically tick a box. It'll say, do you suspect this or that? And you tick it, and if it's okay, well, that means you should move on to this thing. We actually have a whole system in place of how we deal with things. Everything has to be reported. Who it's reported to and how it's reported is determined by our mandatory reporting guidelines. Reshaping the mandatory reporting system. In 2010, a new statutory reporting threshold, the level at which something gets reported to the DOCJ, started in New South Wales. Now, when a mandatory reporter, like me or a social worker, is concerned about suspected abuse or neglect of a child, they need to think about whether or not the risk of harm to the child or young person is significant, rather than the old system, which was just risk of harm. And that's a tricky slope. As I said, we have our mandatory reporting guideline thing that we go this, that, and it tells us what our next step should be. Because I don't ever want to misstep in this area again. Okay, so what this really means is that only the most serious cases are reported to the DOCJ where there is a risk of significant harm. Is this good or bad? It's bad for those cases that slip through the cracks that you think there's not that great a risk, but it is good if it is allowing the most serious cases to be investigated quicker, and if the system's not being clogged up with unnecessary reportings. Not that any reporting is unnecessary. It's a tricky one. Okay, non-legal response. Oh, I don't know, I've got a number 2 there. Why is that a number 2? Going back in my booklet, maybe that's just a typo. Yeah, pretty much. Okay, pretty much just a typo on my part, so don't worry about the number 2 so much. Non-government involvement, increasing non-government involvement. What's happened there? Okay, so the new law is transferring to the non-government sector the responsibility for early intervention programs. Expanding the role of NGOs in providing services to children and families is a critical component of Keep Them Safe. This means that only the most serious cases are reported to the DOCJ where there is a risk of significant harm. Okay, so this kind of answers our question from the last slide. Only the most serious are going to the DOCJ, but with the involvement of non-government organisations, they are able to look at those cases which are considered less serious at the time of reporting. Collaboration and consultation between the government and NGOs also occurs through the Child Protection Advisory Group. Okay, so the fact that the two organisations are talking to each other and working together will hopefully, again, reduce the number of kids that do fall through the cracks in the system. The law has pushed non-government organisations to provide more of the services that families need to try to help the problem rather than just go in there and smash it on the head. So, for example, we have the family referral services to assist children and young people who do not meet the threshold for child protection intervention by the DOCJ or the police, but would benefit from accessing support to address current problems and to prevent problems from actually getting worse. Family referral services were piloted from 2010 in New South Wales. For example, there is Relationships Australia, they are an NGO that started a telephone family referral service in Mount Druitt. And yeah, laugh or not at Mount Druitt, but look, Mount Druitt has a lot of low socioeconomic people living in less than ideal circumstances in a less than beautiful place, and that kind of stress causes problems and can have massive effects on families. Family referral services will refer clients to services such as housing, childcare, supported playgroup, drug and alcohol, mental health services, and youth services. The support provided may include home visiting, parenting education, respite care, and son case management. Anyone who's lost, we're now on page 89. The law has pushed non-government organisations to provide more of the services that families need. For example, Life Without Barriers is one of the NGOs involved in the foster care cases. This was transferred from the DOCJ. They have the tricky role of caring for kids who are still legally related to the parents that have abused or neglected them. So they do things like organising safe access visits to try to maintain the relationship while still protecting the children. The New South Wales Ombudsman released a report review of the New South Wales Child Protection System, Are Things Improving, back in 2014, finding that a few years after the Wood inquiry, there were still some serious problems. We've got good news, bad news. Good news, the percentage of children reported as being at risk of severe harm who were actually seen by caseworkers increased from 21 to 28%. It's not a massive jump, but it's a jump in the right direction. Bad news still means that more than 2/3 of the children who'd been reported didn't get a face-to-face meeting with a caseworker. The report also found that thousands of cases were being closed because of inadequate resources. That means labelled as being closed due to competing priorities, with the only action taken in a lot of cases being a phone call to someone, for example, the child's school. It's one of the reasons why our roles at school are an official legal document, because an indicator of child abuse or neglect might be the lack of attendance at school, and so our roles are quite often used in court cases and investigations like this to determine whether or not a child is being adequately cared for. 3 years later. Hopefully all these lessons had been learned. There was another look at the system. So the New South Wales Child Protection Inquiry, which was a parliamentary committee, found that still only 30% of children reported as being at risk of serious harm were seen face-to-face. It was still FACS then. FACS was described as a ship that had already sunk in dealing with child protection, and there were still almost 20,000 kids in out-of-home care or foster care. Let's look at our non-legal responses, looking at the media. Okay, in Australia, it was the enormous media attention surrounding the deaths of children which led to public outrage and resulted in significant legal changes in the area of child protection in the 90s and again in the late 2000s. The murder of Darcy Freeman led the media in Victoria to push for further reform of their child protection system. For example, Freeman case sparks call for change at the age 2011. But this was difficult given that the father had negotiated time with her himself rather than the court deciding. Linked to stories on Darcy Freeman and what happened in that case. Again, these are stories involving children and they're not fun, they're not pretty, but it's because these not fun, not pretty things happen to kids that we need these laws. Another case that had enormous media attention was the case of Keisha Wiperat, I can't say that, where that was the Crown versus Abrams, who was her mother, was the case that came from this. I'm pretty sure we had a quick look at this maybe in prelim. I can't remember, I'm sorry. So I have linked it for you. This case also drew attention to child neglect and abuse. Even the judge said in sentencing Christy Abrams for the murder of her daughter Keisha that she was an inevitable product of entrenched intergenerational failures. And we could probably include the child protection system over those generations in there too. Keisha, there had been reports made about possible child abuse and neglect, obviously not followed up on to a significant degree because it ends in the murder of a child. Again, yep, so that will be in your supplementary clips. Okay, what I've attached here is actually a really kind of interesting online virtual decision making, not a game, but essentially it gives you a bunch of scenarios and it asks you to decide would you remove these children from their families. And it's well worth having a look at just to see how difficult sometimes it can be to know what the right decision is to make. Humans are imperfect. That's why we're called human. Otherwise, we'd be gods. And that's it. That is our last video for the material for legal studies for the HSC. Congratulations, guys. You got this far. Yeah, from this point on, I'm releasing this week 10. Oh, my phone's ringing. Do some revision activities, go out in the sun, have fun. I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.